You've probably heard the saying, "You can never go home again." Some of us have lived the truth of that saying. When you leave home, you have a wide range of experiences that reshape how you view yourself, how you view your upbringing, how you view the world. Now, as former Senator Ben Sasse has observed, that can be a really good thing for you. In fact, he argues that you don't really know your home until you've left it. But for those you leave behind, it can be rather disconcerting. They didn't share your experiences, and so they don't share your perspective. That's certainly part of the story that we see played out in this morning's episode. But it's not the whole story. You see, Jesus had an identity from birth, and he was given a vocation by his true Father that could not help but shape his life. And the way that that identity and that vocation had shaped his life was not terribly welcomed by the people in his hometown. Now, this story is found in all three of what we call the synoptic gospels: Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So what we want to do is we want to start by asking, what is it that Matthew does not emphasize in the story? Okay? What are the things that Matthew doesn't highlight? And there are at least three of them. Matthew does not highlight the central role that this episode played in shaping Jesus' own ministry and self-understanding. When this story is told in Luke's gospel, it's told in chapter 4, at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. It is kind of a kicking off point for Luke's gospel of Jesus' public life. That's not where Matthew places it. Matthew tucks it away in the end of what in our Bibles is chapter 13. Chapter 13. It's at the beginning of a major section, 1353 through 1727. And it certainly shapes the way that we read that section of Matthew's gospel. But it doesn't play the same kind of role for Matthew that it does for Luke. Moreover, unlike Luke, Matthew tells us nothing of what Jesus actually preached. And this is surprising because the account that we have in Luke's gospel talks a lot about the fulfillment of prophecy. And Matthew is always interested in showing how Jesus fulfills prophecy. But he leaves that out here. And then, of course, we don't really see anything of the actual sort of details of what happens. And especially, we don't see the violence of their reaction. We don't see that. So what is it that Matthew is trying to emphasize? What is it that Matthew really wants us to focus on? It is the reception that Jesus received. And more specifically, it is the hostility of that reception. Now, you heard Natalia read the New International Version, and there in verse 54 or so, it says that they were amazed. That's how the NIV translates it. It's a perfectly acceptable translation. But in this case, I would actually prefer the word astonished. Because in American English at least, amazed has a tinge of positive to it, where astonished can be either positive or negative. And that's really more how this Greek word functions. And it is certainly a better description of what happens in this text. Now, you're sitting there looking over their objection. How do we understand that objection? What is it that has them so hostile towards Jesus? Well, just to sum it up, Jesus wasn't staying true to his roots. He hadn't stayed true to his geographical roots. Instead of hanging out at Nazareth and sticking there with his sisters, he's running around Galilee. He hadn't stayed true to his familial roots. Now, this is one we want to take a little bit of time with. Notice they name all his brothers, and then they mention that all his sisters live with them, live in their community, or at least in their vicinity. Notice, too, that they mention Mary, his mother, by name. Now, let's just take a little moment there for a brief aside. They're mentioning Mary by name, right? Well, what if they know something of Mary's story, right? You can almost hear the sarcasm. How can someone holy, come from a sinner? Because, of course, they're not going to believe this whole virginal conception thing, right? This girl gets pregnant out of wedlock, and you're telling me that this man is a holy person, that we're supposed to listen to him? They're impugning Jesus, perhaps, by reminding one another of his less than ideal heritage. Jesus has departed from his familial roots, but he's also departed from his vocational roots. Notice they don't mention Joseph by name, they mention him by vocation. Isn't this the carpenter's son? You're not supposed to be running around teaching people about God. You're supposed to be building that bookcase I need. Right? Ultimately, what they're saying is, we know who you really are. And of course, the subtext of that is, who you really are is who we say you are. We'll come back to that in a moment. You might be able to fool those people in Capernaum or Bethsaida or wherever. You might be able to fool those people, but you can't fool us. We know who you are. Right? So how does Jesus respond to that objection? How does he respond to their hostility? He begins by basically just coming up with a proverb right on the spot. A prophet is not without honor, except in his own hometown and in his own home, right? That word honor is very interesting because they are, in fact, dishonoring him. And remember what I've taught you before, that honor is the thing that these people want most. But honor is something that can only be conferred in this culture by others. Okay, we'll come back to that in a moment too. All right? Now, this is an interesting thing that Jesus says. It feels like a quote from somewhere, but it's not, as far as we can tell. And you wonder, what's the biblical precedent for this notion? There's not an immediate one that pops to mind, except maybe Jeremiah. Nevertheless, it is a common Christian experience. William Carey, who really helped kick off the modern missions movement in Britain, had challenging circumstances even in his own family. Now, there were some other reasons for that, but there were those in his own family who struggled with his mission. We see this even more clearly in the life of C.S. Lewis, who is perhaps the most important defender of the gospel in the 20th century. And yet, he never managed to convince his brother or his stepson. Dallas Willard, the most important, perhaps, spiritual formation leader in the 20th century and early part of the 21st century, had children who struggled with their adherence to the faith. And in Willard's case, he's a man who spent his whole life trying to talk about creating spiritual change, and his wife was a marriage and family therapist, and yet their children were wayward for some time. But of course, it's not just famous people who have this experience. Many of you have had it too. You have known children or stepchildren who wanted nothing to do with Christ. You've had siblings or parents who rejected your witness for Jesus. You've had friends that you have loved your whole life long, and yet who walked away from faith. It is, unfortunately, not an uncommon experience. And I guess there really is some theological logic to what Jesus is saying here. After all, when we have the kind of encounter with God that Jesus had had, that the prophets had had, that encounter cannot help but change us. Think about Isaiah 6. That encounter cannot help but alter our perspective. It cannot help but change the way we view the world. And people don't always like that. But why is that? Why is it that people will sometimes, even people that we love deeply and that are very close to us, why is it that they will turn away from us? Why was it that the people of Nazareth rejected Jesus with such hostility? I mean, after all, yes, they were operating on the basis of cultural scripts that were well worn in their society, but at the same time, they had an obligation of chesed, of mutual love and faithfulness and devotion to Jesus. They had an obligation to be loyal to Him, to believe in Him. Why didn't they? Well, the first explanation is a cultural one, but it's actually a cultural one that we can relate to. We've been talking about it all along. In that society, identity was not something that you formed yourself. It was something that your community formed for you. They decided who you were. That's why honor was so valued. It was so treasured, because honor in their society is the public affirmation, the public acknowledgement of your worth. You know, when we think of honor, we think of the Marines, and we think of acting honorably whether people see it or not, right? We think of acting in a way that is worthy of honor. But that's not how they used that term. And honor was something that they deeply desired, because the cultural script was that your identity was supposed to be the construct of what other people thought of you. Now, that uses some rather sophisticated language, but the truth is, we know exactly how that feels. And some of us more than others. Oh, well, you're just the blind guy, or you're just the woman with a learning disability, or you're just that troublemaker, you're just this, you're just that. And it's society, or the high school lunch table, deciding who we are supposed to be, right? So even though this is not as big of a thing in our culture, we still experience it. We know what it's like. A second explanation has to do with, I call it here, ethno-political realities. And it's basically just this thing that we as humans, we like to do the us versus them thing, right? And that can function at lots of different levels. But in Nazareth, Jesus has set Himself apart. He has made Himself different, which means He's not part of us. Well, if He's not part of us, then that means He's part of them, whoever the them happens to be. But the thing is, we nearly always assume that them is somehow hostile to us, that they are a threat. Now think about how this functions in our own life. If you start acting like some other group of people in your own town, people are going to be like, what's wrong with you? If since Roy's not here, we can pick on him. If Roy goes out and grows an afro, people are going to, and starts wearing purple suits, people are going to think, something's wrong with him, right? Now that's, it's a goofy example, but it illustrates a very serious reality. What happens if you're a Democrat who says, hey, we need to stop aborting children. This is just not something we can do. What happens if you're a Republican who says, look, We need comprehensive immigration reform and not just, build a wall. You're going to be demonized, right? Because you are betraying us for them. Now, I use politics because that's a really good, you know immediately about the conflict there. But the thing is, that happens in lots of areas of life, including families. And sometimes when you decide to follow Jesus, what happens is your family feels alienated. You have left us and joined them. Right? So we've got a cultural explanation, we've got an ethno-political explanation, but we got 3 psychological explanations, and they're all related to each other, and I think they'll make a lot of sense to you. The first one, we've got another proverb here. Familiarity breeds content. Not content. Contempt. How about that? Familiarity breeds contempt. So, the people who are around you, they don't just know all your good points. They know all your faults too. And to be honest, they know them better than you do. Right? Now, if that happened to Jesus and Jesus didn't have any faults, how much more does it happen to us? Right? But there's another piece to that. Okay? Sometimes our views of people become calcified. They become set in concrete. We don't change, even as the person changes. And what happens is our brains are like prediction machines, okay? Our brains love to be able to predict what's going to happen. They don't like change, actually. So, but here's the thing. Let's say Nelda and Natalia had known each other for 25 years. And let's say Natalia has this sort of calcified view in her mind of what Nelda's like that's from 25 years ago. Well, anytime Natalia wants to reinforce that view that she has of Nelda, all she has to do is push Nelda's buttons. Because, of course, she's known Nelda for 25 years. She knows where her buttons are, right? And when she pushes those buttons, she's going to push them long enough until Nelda reacts the way that Natalia's brain predicts she will react. And then Natalia just says, see, I told you she hadn't changed. Mm-hmm. Now, added to both of those realities is this simple fact. We don't know people as well as we think we do anyway. We just don't. David Brooks recently reported in his book, How to Know a Person, that the average human being, when they encounter a person for the first time, is only about 20% accurate in predicting what that person thinks or feels whenever they have an interaction. So let's illustrate this way. Let's say you and I meet for the first time, and we shake hands, and at first I make eye contact with you, but then I look down and I start to grimace. What's your brain going to think? Oh no, what do I stink? Does he not like me? Does he, is there something wrong with him? What does he think? Because most of our insecurities revolve around us. When what's really going on is that I have gas and I'm trying not to embarrass myself. You see? That's how this, and when you're talking about things that are even more subtle than that, you can see how those mistakes might take place. And then, of course, now just work your way back through our list. those mistakes get calcified in our minds, those mistaken viewpoints, they get calcified, and we think we know somebody because we've been around them, right? Oh, by the way, Brooks also reports that we don't get much better the more that we know somebody. The average person is only 35% effective in predicting what their spouse thinks. Now, by the way, some people are way better at this. Some people are way worse. So, it's not like nobody ever knows what anybody's thinking, but we're not very good at it. And we can create all those misconceptions. So you see, Jesus doesn't talk about any of this stuff, but it's important for us to have in our minds because a lot of this is what's swirling around in that Nazareth synagogue. And it's what swirls around in our own interactions with the people that we love. So that's Jesus' first reaction. His first reaction is to point out to them what's happening, right? But his second reaction is perhaps even sadder, even more troubling. He doesn't do many miracles there. Why? Because hostility is the opposite of faith. Hostility is truly the opposite of faith. Think about it this way. Let's imagine for a moment that we're about to have a pickup game of basketball, and we're about to have this pickup game against, say Buster's Church down the road, right? Okay. And Roy comes hobbling out there on his walker and says, not only does he say, hey, throw the ball to me, I can make shots. He says, throw the ball to me up near the rim and I'll dunk it home. Now, then you ask me, well, Pastor, do you believe that Roy can dunk a basketball 3 weeks after hip replacement surgery? It's not just that I don't believe he can do it, it's that I believe he cannot do it, right? Right? It's not just that I'm I'm not sure about that. I was like, no, I'm not throwing the ball to Roy. I'm not going to throw the ball up near the rim and hope that Roy can jump up there, grab the ball, and dunk it home. That he can do an alley-oop. It's not going to happen. I actively believe that he cannot do it. How can Jesus do the things that he wants to do in that kind of context? Right? Now, a lot of this is just sort of interesting trivia unless we ask ourselves, why did Matthew tell this story? Because although this story doesn't frame Matthew's entire presentation of Jesus' ministry, it does frame this particular section. Why is this so important to Matthew? That's where we want to conclude this morning because that's where it's going to really touch us. Like Jesus so often did, in our text, Jesus is practicing what he preached. He told his disciples that the kingdom may very well disrupt their family relationships, their relationships with people that are closest to them. And sure enough, here it is. It's happening, right? But we should not presume that Jesus just went through this without any sort of pain, any sort of emotional reaction. And I think that's why Matthew tells this story. Is he wants us to know Jesus knows what you are experiencing when you experience this kind of rejection because he's lived through it too. Remember what the writer of Hebrews tells us. Jesus has experienced every trial that we have. He empathizes with us in our weakness. Why? Because He's been there. And so, when our kids spit on everything that we believe, when our friends turn their backs on us and publicly ridicule us for our faith, as happened to Billy Graham, when our neighbors mock us for being religious, Jesus doesn't come to that experience with sort of just a, well, that's life. Get over it. No. He walks with us in the midst of that rejection. Now, sometimes our testimony for Jesus is rejected because we don't live up to what we say we believe. That does happen, okay? And we need to acknowledge that fact. And it can happen because I individually don't live up to my faith. It can happen because we as a congregation or as a denomination or as the church writ large don't live up to our faith. But sometimes, in fact, I would say often, people turn away from the faith for reasons that don't have to do with our indiscretions necessarily. And it's not something that we do ourselves. Even though we know that following Jesus may mean walking away from some relationships, most of the time that's not what happens. We're still preserving the relationship. It's just that we've been changed by our encounter with the gospel. It's not even so much that people reject our faith in Christ per se. Now, they may not accept it for themselves, but as long as our faith in Christ doesn't impact them, they're fine with it, right? But it's when our faith in Christ changes the way we treat people, the way we relate to those who disagree with us, the way we bear up under temptation. That's when people start to feel threatened. That's when people start to feel that anxiety that motivates what Steve Cuss calls reactivity. Now, Jesus does not tell us how to overcome that resistance to the gospel. He doesn't. I wish He did. He doesn't. What He models for us is a patient and resilient devotion to God. A devotion to God that keeps us centered on the kingdom and its purposes, even in the face of opposition. But I can tell you that sometimes patient, resilient faith will bear fruit in the lives of the people around us. Now, we'll have to be humble enough to admit our mistakes. We'll have to be self-aware enough to know what those mistakes are. But when people see in us that Christ has forgiven us, that we have truly repented, that we're making strides, that we're making progress, and that Christ is with us. That's the most important thing, that Christ is with us in the highs and in the lows of life. Now we are in the best position to influence them for the gospel. May we have, as individuals and as a church, that kind of humble, honest, patient, and resilient